My in-laws forced me to sign a prenup before marrying their son. They thought it would protect him, but the day I inherited $20 million, their smiles told me everything I needed to know. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Claire Evans. I was 29, a nurse from Ohio, someone who grew up in a middle-class family where love mattered more than money. I thought I had found my forever when I met Daniel Miller, a lawyer who swept me off my feet with his charm, ambition, and easy smile. He came from money, old family money, the kind of wealth that carried expectations and rules. I thought love would be enough to bridge our different worlds. But from the moment I met his parents, Richard and Margaret Miller, I felt their coldness. They shook my hand with polite smiles, but behind their eyes was judgment. They didn't care that I worked 12-hour shifts helping people. To them, I was just a nurse, not their kind of people. When Daniel proposed, I was over the moon. But only weeks before the wedding, Richard and Margaret called us into their study. Papers sat on the polished oak table, and Margaret's voice was sharp when she said, "If you want to be part of this family, you'll sign this." It was a prenuptial agreement. Every line of it screamed one thing: they didn't trust me. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend me, but he just sat there, silent, jaw tight, avoiding my eye. My stomach sank. I felt cornered, like the walls were closing in. I argued at first. I asked if they thought I was only marrying Daniel for money. Richard chuckled, a sound that cut deep. "It's not about that," he said. "It's about protecting what belongs to Daniel." The message was clear. They thought I was beneath him, someone who didn't deserve a piece of their fortune. In that moment, I wanted to walk away. My pride screamed at me to get up, to leave the room and never look back. But then I looked at Daniel. I thought of the man I had fallen in love with, the nights we spent talking about dreams, the future we promised each other. Love, I told myself, mattered more than paperwork. With a heavy heart, I signed. My hand shook as the pen moved across the page. Inside, something cracked, but I pushed it down. I told myself it didn't matter because Daniel loved me, and that was enough. I put on a brave face that night, smiling through dinner, pretending it was fine. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease. I had just promised to spend my life with a man who wouldn't even fight for me against his parents. Still, I buried those doubts. I believed in love, even if it meant swallowing my pride. That was only the beginning. The wedding was beautiful on the surface, but beneath the smiles and champagne, I felt the weight of my new reality. Once I became Mrs. Miller, the chill in the air around his parents never warmed. Margaret made her disapproval clear in small but cutting remarks. At dinners, she would glance at my shoes and say, "Practical, I suppose," or question why I worked such long shifts when Daniel's position should have been enough. Every word dripped with the reminder that I wasn't who she wanted in their world. Richard was no softer. He rarely spoke to me directly, preferring to address Daniel in front of me, as if I weren't there. "You should be thinking about partnerships, politics, influence," he would say, his voice booming through their grand dining room. "A man like you needs to build a name, not waste time with distractions." I knew I was the distraction he meant. At first, Daniel tried to balance it, but slowly, I noticed him changing. He started dressing sharper, talking about country clubs and networking, topics that never mattered to us before. When I brought up how uncomfortable I felt, he brushed it aside. "They're just old-fashioned," he'd say, but the way he repeated their phrases, their exact criticisms, told me something else. The more time he spent with them, the less I recognized the man I had fallen for. I felt like a guest in my own marriage. When we visited his parents, I would sit quietly at the long, polished table, listening to conversations about people I didn't know and investments I didn't care about. If I tried to join in, Margaret would smile thinly and turn the subject. Daniel rarely noticed. He was too busy proving himself to them. Nights at home weren't much better. He worked longer hours, came home later, and when he did, his phone was often in his hand, responding to messages that I was never part of. The warmth we once shared, late-night talks, laughter over small things, slipped away piece by piece. I reached for him, but it was like trying to hold water. Still, I told myself to keep going. I had made vows, promises I wanted to honor. When I felt invisible in his parents' mansion, I reminded myself of the love we once had. When Daniel's tone mirrored his father's sharpness, I told myself it was stress. I thought if I just held on, if I just endured, maybe things would get better. But deep down, something gnawed at me. I had stepped into a family where I would never belong, and the man who was supposed to stand by me was slowly walking away. I kept quiet, pushing through the loneliness, because I believed love was enough. I didn't know then how quickly that belief would be tested. News arrived one quiet morning, delivered in the form of a crisp letter. My uncle James Evans, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, had passed away. He had built his fortune through decades of relentless work, running companies I barely understood as a child. We had drifted apart after family disagreements, but now his name appeared again, attached to something I could hardly process. The letter explained that, with no children of his own, he had left nearly everything to me. The figure sat on the page like a weight, $20 million. I read it 3 times, convinced I had misunderstood. My upbringing had been modest, steady but never extravagant. The thought of holding that kind of wealth felt impossible, almost like a trick. When Daniel learned the details, his eyes widened. He hugged me tightly, but there was something in his expression, excitement edged with calculation. I brushed it off, overwhelmed by the shock. Soon, word spread to his parents, and that was when the shift began. Margaret, who had spent months criticizing me, suddenly spoke with honey in her voice. She asked about my favorite meals, complimented my hair, even called me dear. Richard, once distant and dismissive, started drawing me into conversations at their table. He asked about my plans, my vision for the future, as if I had suddenly become someone worth listening to. The sudden warmth unsettled me. Their smiles felt too practiced, their questions too pointed. It was as though they weren't seeing me at all. They were seeing numbers. I noticed the way Richard's eyes lingered whenever I mentioned accounts or paperwork, the way Margaret slipped in comments about family investments and long-term security. I confided in Daniel, telling him the change felt unnatural, almost staged. He waved it away with an easy laugh. "They're just finally accepting you," he said, pulling me close. "This is what you wanted, right? For them to see you as part of the family." His words were meant to comfort, but something inside me didn't settle. The money was real, sitting in accounts under my name, and it created a silence I didn't know how to fill. Part of me felt grateful, relieved that years of financial worry were gone. But another part of me, the louder part, feared what this windfall would reveal about the people around me. The Millers' sudden affection was too sharp a turn, like sunlight after weeks of rain. And though I smiled politely at their interest, deep down I knew their approval had nothing to do with me. It didn't take long before Daniel's attitude began to shift. Subtle at first, it showed in the way he spoke, the confidence that bled into his tone when he talked about plans we had never discussed. Weekend trips became impulsive purchases. Dinners out turned into bottles of wine that cost more than my entire grocery bill had before. Each time I raised an eyebrow, he would flash a grin and say, "Relax, we can afford it now." I tried to remind him that the inheritance wasn't ours, not in the way he imagined. The agreement his parents had once pressed on me made that clear. "The prenup protects everything," I said carefully one evening as he scrolled through listings for a sports car. His face hardened. "You really think that piece of paper should stand between us? We're married. What's yours is mine." The conversation spiraled. I told him security mattered to me, that I wasn't comfortable treating money like an endless fountain. He scoffed, calling me cautious, almost stingy. That word stung. I had always been practical, but now, in his eyes, I was an obstacle. It wasn't just Daniel. His mother began planting ideas with her syrupy voice. Over tea, she leaned forward, hands folded, and suggested I consider contributing to ventures that support the family's legacy. Her meaning was obvious. Their companies, their projects, their interests. When I didn't immediately agree, her smile faltered before returning even sweeter. "Think of it as an investment in the future," she said, though the future she spoke of clearly wasn't mine. Richard echoed her sentiment in more direct terms. During a dinner conversation, he praised the expansion of one of their firms, then casually mentioned that a cash injection could push it over the edge. He looked at me as though waiting for confirmation. I nodded politely, my mind churning. At home, Daniel pressed harder. He wanted joint accounts, larger purchases, decisions that put me in the passenger seat while he took the wheel. I reminded him the inheritance was separate for a reason. His reply was sharp. "If you can't trust me with it, what does that say about us?" That single question carried the weight of a challenge. I felt as if he was testing me, pushing boundaries to see how far I would bend. The man who once dreamed of building a life together now seemed fixated on control, and every day that passed, the distance between us widened. It was late, the kind of quiet hour when the house seemed to breathe on its own. I had gone to bed earlier, but the sound of a low voice carried down the hallway, pulling me awake. I slipped from the sheets, padded barefoot toward the glow seeping under the study door, and paused. Daniel's tone was hushed but firm, threaded with certainty. I held my breath and leaned closer. "Don't worry," he said, his voice smooth. "Once I convince her to move the money into joint accounts, she won't have a choice." The words sliced through me. Heat rushed to my face, my chest tightening as if the air itself had turned heavy. He wasn't talking about building a future or sharing a dream. He was talking about control, about taking what had been left to me. I froze in place, one hand pressed to the wall to steady myself. My mind raced, searching for explanations, excuses, anything that could soften what I had just heard. But the tone of his voice told me there was no misunderstanding. He wasn't guessing, he wasn't joking, he was planning. I slipped back into the bedroom before he could notice me lingering. My body moved on autopilot, crawling beneath the covers, arranging myself as though I had been there all along. When he finally joined me, he kissed my forehead, casual as ever, and whispered, "Sleep well." I lay perfectly still, my eyes open in the dark, my pulse hammering against the pillow. Inside, fury brewed, cold and sharp. I thought of every moment I had defended him, every doubt I had buried, every time I told myself love was enough. Was it ever real? Had I been a convenience, a path to a fortune he never expected me to receive? The silence in the room grew louder than his breathing beside me. I stared into the darkness, replaying his words again and again until they etched themselves into me. She won't have a choice. That sentence wasn't just about money. It was about power, about stripping me of my will. For the first time, I looked at Daniel not as the man I had once adored, but as someone I couldn't trust. The love I had clung to now trembled under the weight of betrayal. A question rooted itself in me, refusing to let go. Had he ever truly loved me at all, or had I been blind to the truth from the beginning? I woke the next morning with a new resolve. The shock from what I had overheard had hardened into something sharper, determination. If Daniel and his parents were plotting, I needed to be 2 steps ahead. The first call I made was to a lawyer, one who had no ties to the Millers. I set up meetings under the guise of running errands, slipping away during breaks. With calm precision, I asked questions about asset protection, about keeping wealth separate, about how far the prenup stretched in court. Each answer steadied me, gave me ground to stand on. From that point on, I became deliberate. Bank accounts remained in my name, passwords changed, files secured. I stored copies of everything, statements, letters, contracts, in a safe place only I knew about. What had once felt like an unexpected blessing now felt like armor. At the same time, I began to keep track of words and actions. A notebook hidden in my dresser filled with details. Exact phrases Margaret used when hinting at investments, dates Daniel pressed me about large purchases, Richard's comments about future contributions. Every small interaction became a piece of evidence. Every slip of their greed written down in careful lines. Daniel's persistence only grew. Over breakfast, he casually mentioned how much simpler life would be with one account. In the evenings, he brought up dream trips, abroad, or the idea of starting a family fund with his parents. His tone always carried a layer of charm, but beneath it was insistence. I nodded, laughed lightly, and gave non-committal answers. On the surface, I played the role of the agreeable wife, offering smiles and soft words. Inside, though, each request sharpened my focus. They believed they were pulling me closer into their circle, but in reality, I was watching them reveal themselves piece by piece. Every time Margaret leaned across the table with her polished nails tapping against her glass and spoke of responsibility, I smiled sweetly while writing her words down in memory. Every time Daniel slipped his arm around me, speaking about trust, I thought of the call I had overheard and reminded myself of the truth. They underestimated me. They thought I was naive, too gentle to push back. What they didn't see was the storm building under the calm surface. I wasn't planning to protect only the inheritance anymore. I was preparing to protect myself, and when the time came, I would be ready. The evening began like so many others. An elaborate dinner at the Millers' sprawling home, crystal glasses gleaming under the chandelier, the air thick with unspoken expectations. I sat across from Margaret, her smile stretched tight, the kind of expression that never reached her eyes. Halfway through the meal, she set down her fork and looked directly at me. "You know, Claire," she said, her tone light but cutting, "what this family really needs is a vacation property, a place we can all gather, away from the city. It would be a wonderful way for you to show your commitment, to provide stability for everyone." The table fell silent. Richard nodded as if the idea were already decided, and Daniel's eyes flicked to me. My pulse quickened, but I straightened in my chair. "I'm not buying a house for this family," I said evenly, my voice calm but firm. "That's not happening." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Margaret's expression froze, her lips pressing into a thin line. Daniel's face reddened, and his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he leaned forward. "Do you hear yourself?" he snapped. "They're asking for something that benefits everyone, and you're being stubborn. You're so damn selfish." The word echoed inside me, sharp and final. I kept my composure, refusing to let him see how deep it cut. The rest of the meal passed in brittle silence, the clinking of cutlery the only sound between us. Later, back at our house, the argument reignited. Daniel paced the living room, his hands clenched, his voice rising with each sentence. "You need to decide what matters," he said, pointing at me as though I were on trial. "Either you're part of this family, or you can cling to your precious money. But you can't have both." I stood there, staring at the man I had once trusted with my whole heart. His words weren't a plea, they were an ultimatum. And in that moment, the last thread tying me to him snapped. This wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a battle, one I hadn't chosen but could no longer ignore. The realization settled over me like cold steel. Whatever love we once shared had been smothered by greed and control. My marriage wasn't just strained, it was broken beyond repair. I didn't announce my decision. I moved in silence, each step calculated, each action deliberate. While Daniel ranted about loyalty and family, I met with my attorney behind closed doors. Papers were prepared with precision, the very document his parents once celebrated now serving as the foundation of my plan. I remembered Richard's smug voice the day he explained why I needed to sign before the wedding. "This ensures Daniel is protected," he had said, almost gleeful. At the time, I swallowed my pride. Now, those same words worked in my favor. The clauses they crafted so carefully left my inheritance untouched, sealed off from their reach. When the time came, the documents were filed quietly, without warning. Daniel didn't suspect a thing. He still believed he could wear me down, convince me to hand over control. He never imagined I'd take the very contract his parents forced on me and use it to shut them out. The day he was served, I was in the kitchen pouring coffee. His footsteps thundered down the hallway as he burst in, papers clenched in his fist, his face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You don't get to walk away from me like this. You don't get to betray me." I met his fury with silence, holding his gaze without flinching. Inside, a calm spread through me, steady and unshakable. For months, I had played the part of the accommodating wife, listening to demands and dodging traps. Now the performance was over. He slammed the papers onto the counter, his hands trembling. "You think this makes you smart? You think you've won? You'll see what happens when you cross me." His words rolled off me like water. For the first time in a long while, I felt untouchable. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't just about money. It was about power, about reclaiming the voice I had silenced for too long. The very mechanism designed to cage me had become my shield, and the irony wasn't lost on me. As his anger echoed through the house, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. The balance had shifted. For once, I wasn't the one trapped. The tables had turned, and he knew it. The Millers didn't take the news quietly. Almost immediately after Daniel received the papers, their lawyers descended, trying to tear apart the agreement they once bragged about. Meetings were scheduled, filings submitted, every tactic they could muster thrown at me in hopes of prying something loose. But the contract was airtight, their own creation, and every clause locked them out from the wealth they coveted. Hearing their arguments in court was almost surreal. Richard, who had once gloated about protecting his son's fortune, now looked cornered. Margaret's practiced elegance slipped each time the judge reaffirmed the document's validity. No matter how hard they pushed, the outcome never shifted. The inheritance remained untouched, shielded by their own insistence years ago. When the dust settled, Daniel was left with nothing beyond what he had entered the marriage with. No windfall, no joint accounts, no claim to the money he had counted on. The look on his face when the decision was finalized was one I will never forget, disbelief mixed with humiliation. Outside the courtroom, whispers began to spread. Their friends, colleagues, and business partners heard the story. The proud family who once paraded their status now carried a stain they couldn't wash away. Invitations dwindled, partnerships dissolved, and the influence Richard had wielded so confidently weakened. Margaret, always so concerned with appearances, struggled to maintain the polished image she'd guarded for decades. Daniel's fall was even sharper. Once seen as the promising attorney with charm and connections, he became the man who lost everything in a divorce he thought he controlled. The same circles that once admired him now traded stories about his arrogance, his failure to secure what he believed was his by right. His reputation, once a stepping stone, crumbled beneath him. For me, the end didn't come with fanfare or triumph. It came with peace. Walking away without compromise, I carried not just the inheritance, but something far more valuable, my independence. I had faced their schemes, endured their contempt, and come out stronger on the other side. The marriage was gone, the ties severed, but I wasn't broken. If anything, I had reclaimed the pieces of myself I had once set aside in the name of love. Free of their grip, I stepped into a future that belonged entirely to me. Months passed, and the storm that had consumed my life slowly quieted. With the battles behind me, I began to think about what I truly wanted to do with the future that was finally mine. Growing up in a small town, I had seen neighbors struggle to get medical care, families forced to drive hours just to see a doctor. I decided to use a portion of what I had been given to change that. Plans took shape, and soon the old brick building on Main Street was transformed into a health clinic. The paint was fresh, the rooms filled with equipment, the halls alive with possibility. For the first time in years, I felt light again. Each time I walked through those doors, watching patients arrive and staff greet them with warmth, I knew the money was doing something meaningful. It wasn't being drained into someone else's greed. It was creating hope in a place that desperately needed it. That choice gave me a sense of peace the Millers could never understand. Their world revolved around appearances and power, while mine now centered on something real. Every grateful smile I received reminded me that I had chosen the right path, one far removed from the cold dining tables and endless demands that once defined my life. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, I stopped at a small bar near town. The air smelled of beer and fried food, laughter spilling from a group in the corner. That's when I saw him. Daniel sat hunched at the counter, a glass in front of him, his once polished presence dulled. His shoulders slumped, his eyes tired. He looked nothing like the man I had once married. He noticed me almost immediately. Rising unsteadily, he tried to close the space between us, his lips parting as if to speak. For a moment, memories flickered. Our first dates, our early promises. But they were shadows now, distant and hollow. I stopped him with a smile, calm and certain. "Thank you," I said softly, "for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." Without waiting for a reply, I turned and walked away, leaving him behind with his drink and his regret. The weight I had once carried was gone, replaced with clarity. As I stepped out into the night air, the thought struck me with perfect simplicity. The contract his parents had forced on me, the one meant to cage me, had become my greatest shield and my sweetest revenge. Do you think I made the right choice by walking away from Daniel and his family, or should I have tried to give them another chance? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.